Welcome to Deep Life Narratives. So glad you've joined us. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? Your city? Your country? We'd love to know. Prepare for a gripping tale of survival, family, and courage in the wild. Alaskan frontier. Follow Eliza and her journey as she faces storms, secrets, and the fight for a home that wasn't hers, but might just be. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more unforgettable stories of resilience and heart. The steamship groaned as it docked, its hull scraping against the icy pier. Eliza Thornton stepped onto the snow-dusted planks, her fingers clutching a worn letter that promised a new life. The wind bit through her coat, carrying the scent of pine and distant smoke. Around her, Skagway buzzed with chaos. Miners shouting, sled dogs barking, and carts clattering over frozen mud. She scanned the crowd, searching for Thomas Wren, the man who had written to her with vows of marriage and a home, but no familiar face met her gaze. A boy, no older than 12, approached, his eyes wary. "You, Eliza?" he asked. She nodded, heart pounding. "Pa's been gone 3 weeks. Might be dead." He turned and walked away, leaving her to follow. They trudged through the snow-laden streets, past saloons and shuttered shops, until they reached a sagging cabin on the town's edge. Inside, 7 children stared at her, faces pale, eyes hollow. A baby cried from a makeshift cradle. The boy, Elias, handed her a note scrawled in a trembling hand. "Keep them safe from him." Beside it sat a locked trunk bearing Thomas's initials. Eliza stood in the doorway, the cold seeping into her bones. She had journeyed thousands of miles for a promise, only to find a mystery and 8 abandoned children. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. She took a deep breath, stepped inside, and closed the door behind her. What happens next will shock you. Eliza crossed the threshold, boots crunching over the packed snow blown through the warped door. The cabin smelled of old wood, damp wool, and a faint tang of smoke. Shadows clung to the corners where the weak fire barely reached. Boards creaked like brittle bones under her feet. The walls were cracked, thin as paper, letting the wind seep in, whistling through the gaps. Her breath came out in puffs, vanishing into the cold air inside. 7 pairs of eyes watched her, wide and wary. Mara, 10 years old, with tangled hair and a sharp stare, sat cross-legged near the hearth. Dreamy-eyed and thin as a sapling, Lila traced patterns on the dusty floor. Amos, quiet and watchful, clutched a whittled stick in his small hand. Tessa peeked from behind a chair, curious but cautious. Finn, only 4, clung to Mara's sleeve, sniffling. Frail and pale Nora lay bundled in a threadbare blanket while the smallest, Caleb, whimpered in a rough wooden cradle. Eliza's heart clenched. The room was bare except for a battered table, a few wooden stools, and the glow of the hearth. An empty pot hung over the fire except for a thin film of ice. The children's faces were pale, lips dry and cracked. Hunger sat in the room like a silent ghost. She dropped her bag and unwound her shawl, fingers stiff and cold. "Let's make something warm," she murmured, voice steady though her hands shook. She rummaged through the tiny pantry, finding a handful of dried beans, a strip of salt pork, and a few potatoes soft with age. She set to work, chopping, stirring, feeding the sputtering flame with kindling from a basket. The fire crackled weakly, casting thin light across the sagging walls. Mara's voice cut through the silence. "You'll leave like the others." Her words were sharp, her eyes defiant. Eliza met her gaze, steady and quiet. "I might." The children's eyes flickered. Amos shifted, glancing at Eliza, then back to the fire. Finn's whimper rose into a soft cry, and Eliza moved to the cradle, brushing Caleb's damp forehead with the back of her hand. His skin burned hot, and her stomach twisted. She stirred the soup as it bubbled weakly, the scent thin but welcome. Lila edged closer, drawn by the warmth, her thin fingers hovering near the pot. Eliza ladled the watery broth into mismatched tin cups, handing them out individually. The children ate silently, sipping slowly, eyes darting between her and the door as if expecting someone else to burst in. A trunk sat by the wall, its brass latch dull with age. Thomas's initials were carved on the lid. Eliza hesitated, then unlatched it, the hinges groaning. A piece of parchment lay beneath folded shirts and a worn Bible. A map marked with rough pencil lines. Her eyes narrowed as she traced the marks. A gold claim, a name scrawled in the corner, Silas Kane. The paper smelled faintly of tobacco and pine, the scent of a man she had never met yet whose absence filled the room. She folded the map and tucked it back into the trunk, closing it gently. Questions burned in her mind, but no answers came. The wind howled outside, shaking the cabin walls. Snow drifted through the cracks, dusting the floor in fine white powder. Eliza wrapped another quilt around Caleb, tucking it under his chin, listening to his soft, labored breaths. The fire popped, sending sparks into the air. She moved to patch a hole in the quilt, fingers stiff but determined. Mara watched, arms crossed tight. "You're not our Ma," she muttered. Eliza paused, needle poised. "No," she said softly, "but you need someone." The room held its breath. Lila's eyes glistened in the firelight. Amos leaned closer, and even Mara's shoulders sagged just a little. Eliza worked through the night, adding twigs to the fire, mending quilts and wiping fevered foreheads. The cabin creaked and groaned around her, the Alaskan night fierce and unrelenting. Yet within those thin, cold walls, the warmth of her small, determined actions built something fragile but real. When the wind stilled, Eliza sat by the fire, head bowed, fingers aching. Caleb stirred, soft and restless. She rose, lifting him gently, holding him close, feeling the weight of his small body against hers. The children lay curled under blankets, breaths rising and falling in rhythm. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the cabin in white. Eliza stared into the flames, her thoughts tangled. She had come for a promise but found something else, 8 souls waiting in the dark. She told herself she would stay one more day, just until the storm eased, just until the fever broke, just until Caleb's cries softened. The map, the name Silas Kane, the mystery in Thomas's trunk, all of it could wait. For now, there were mouths to feed, quilts to mend, and fires to tend. Her shoulders sagged as she closed her eyes, but her hands kept moving, stitching hope into the torn fabric, feeding flames against the night. She wasn't their mother, not yet. But she was here, and that had to be enough for now. The blizzard struck as a beast loosed from the mountains, roaring and tearing through the night with a fury rattling the cabin's thin walls, rattling the cabin's thin walls. Snow piled high, relentless, a white tide rising against the door, and the wind screamed through every crack and seam as if it could tear the very boards from their nails. Inside, the air was frigid, breath visible in puffs that vanished almost as soon as they formed. The fire burned low, casting faint, trembling shadows that flickered over the children's faces, pale, gaunt, hollow with hunger and fear. Eliza crept through the cramped space, her footsteps muffled by the threadbare rug. Each movement felt heavy, deliberate, as if the cold itself pressed down on her shoulders. She stirred the pot over the fire, the thin gruel barely enough to fill. The cups she handed out one by one. Amos took his with a quiet nod, his hands chapped and raw. Lila clutched hers with both hands, wide eyes fixed on the flame. Mara sat stiff, arms folded tight across her chest, defiance flickering in her gaze even as her lips trembled. Finn nestled into the blankets, whimpering softly, while Tessa peeked over the edge of the hearth, her fingers curling into the frayed fabric of Eliza's skirt. Nora coughed, a rattling sound that scraped against the silence, and Caleb's cries rose in weak, pitiful wails. Eliza's hands worked steadily, tucking quilts, wiping fevered brows, whispering reassurances she wasn't sure she believed. The storm. Outside raged, wind slamming against the walls in angry fists, shaking the windows in their frames. Ice crept across the glass, patterns of frost blooming in the dark. She could hear the weight of the snow settling on the roof. Each flake's a silent threat, each gust of wind a reminder that they were at the mercy of forces far beyond their control. Eliza's gaze landed on the trunk as the children drifted into uneasy sleep. It seemed to hum in the firelight, its brass, latch dull with age, Thomas's initials carved deep into the wood. Heart pounding, she opened it once more, fingers brushing over folded shirts and a worn Bible until they landed on a small, cold shape, the locket. She lifted it, turning it over. In her palm, its surface smooth but cold as ice. Inside, a woman's face stared back at her. Dark eyes, a quiet, unreadable smile. Not the face of a mother she knew. Not the face of the woman who should have been here. A chill ran through her, sharper than the storm outside. Elias's voice, low and steady, cut through the crackle of the fire. "That's not Ma." Eliza turned, slowly, her fingers tightening around the locket. Elias sat cross-legged by the wall, arms wrapped around his knees, eyes dark and steady, far older than his 12 years. "No," Eliza murmured, her voice barely a thread. Elias stared at the fire, the light dancing in his eyes. "Pa fought with Silas Kane," he said quietly, as if the name might summon the man. Eliza's stomach tightened. "Why?" Elias shrugged, his voice tight, thin as the wind's cry. "Gold. Pa said Kane was a cheat, a man you can't trust." The name settled over the room like a weight, heavy and unwelcome. Silas Kane. Again, that name threaded through this family's fabric, a dark, unraveling seam. The storm outside howled, the sound wrapping around the cabin, a living thing that battered and tore. Eliza moved from child to child, tucking blankets closer, her hands brushing across tangled hair, smoothing away fear as best she could. She sat by Finn, who whimpered in his sleep, brushing her fingers across his forehead. His skin burned under her touch, and she felt her breath catch in her chest. She dipped a cloth into the water, cooled by the snow that had crept in, and laid it gently on his brow. Lila inched closer, her voice a whisper. "Tell us a story?" Eliza hesitated, her heart aching at the quiet plea. She settled near the fire, pulling Lila into her lap, feeling the child's thin frame against her. The others stirred, drawn to her voice like moths to a flame. She spoke softly, her words weaving through the crackle of the fire, telling them of fields golden under the sun, a house where the roof leaked in the spring rains, a mother who taught her to sew, and a father who vanished into the dark earth. She told them of storms weathered and nights survived, of learning to mend what was broken, to hold on even when the world threatened to let go. Her words wrapped around them, a thin shield against the cold, a promise whispered into the dark. The children leaned closer, Mara's glare softening, her head dipping, slightly as if to listen. Amos's eyes fluttered shut, the stick slipping from his hand. Tessa's breathing slowed, steady and deep. Finn's small hand curled into hers, his tiny fingers clinging like she might vanish. Caleb's cries quieted, his body settling into an uneasy sleep. Eliza sat among them, her back straight despite the ache in her shoulders, the weight of the storm pressing in from all sides. She could feel the locket cold against her skin, a silent question in the night. Who was the woman? What had Thomas hidden? What danger lurked in the name of Silas Kane? But for now, there were no answers. Only the sound of the wind and the quiet crackle of the fire. She whispered into the stillness, a vow barely audible yet fierce. I'll protect them. I'll stay. Her words held, firm as iron, woven into the night like a thread of hope. The storm battered the walls relentlessly, but Eliza's voice rapped around the children inside the cabin, a fragile but unyielding barrier against the dark. Could you stay in a storm for children who aren't yours? Keep reading to see Eliza's choice. The blizzard had barely passed when a knock thudded on the cabin door, slow and deliberate, each strike echoing through the small space like a warning. Eliza's heart jumped, the sound cutting through the fragile quiet. She rose cautiously, the floor cold beneath her bare feet, and lifted the iron latch. The door creaked open, groaning on its hinges. A man stood framed by the swirling snow, his beard thick with frost, shoulders stooped beneath a coat frayed at the cuffs. His boots left wet, muddy prints on the threshold. His breath steamed in the frigid air, his eyes sharp and watchful, darting to Eliza's face before slipping away, as if he weighed her, but refused to let her see inside him. Yet his hands were steady, fingers rough and work-worn, as he held out a bundle of firewood bound with twine. "Jonah Reed," he said gruffly, voice low and scratchy like gravel dragged across the stone. "Brought wood and meat. Figured you'd need it." Eliza blinked, heart hammering. The children crowded behind her, pale faces peeking over her shoulder, their breath clouding in the cold. Jonah's gaze shifted, pausing on Elias, who stared back with defiance and fear. His eyes lingered on the trunk by the hearth for a fleeting second, a flicker of recognition there, then gone. Eliza stepped aside, hesitant but knowing they couldn't afford to turn help away. Jonah crossed the threshold, snow melting off his boots in dark puddles. The cabin seemed to draw a breath, the firelight catching in the beads of moisture on his coat. He moved with a practiced air, setting down the firewood near the hearth and pulling off his gloves with slow, deliberate movements. His rough and silent presence filled the room as if the wind had taken form and walked through the door. "You knew Thomas?" Eliza's voice was quiet but firm, her question hanging like smoke. Jonah's lips twitched, not quite a smile or frown. "Knew him," he said, tossing another log onto the fire. The flames crackled, spitting sparks that rose and faded into the dim rafters. His hands hovered near the flames, palms splayed, wide. "Long time ago." Eliza watched him closely, noting the lines etched deep around his eyes and how his shoulders stayed tight even as he knelt by the fire as if always braced for trouble. The children pressed close to her, silent but wide-eyed. Lila leaned in, whispering, "He smells like smoke and pine." Eliza gave a small nod, her senses sharp, reading every flicker of movement, every shift in Jonah's stance. "Thomas, where is he?" she asked, her voice thin as the wind outside but steady. Jonah's gaze slid away, landing briefly on the window where snow fell in heavy sheets. "Kane's got a long reach," he muttered, voice thick with warning. "Best you remember that." His words fell heavy, the unspoken threat curling in the air. Mara's brow furrowed, eyes narrowing. "What's Kane want with us?" she asked, her voice edged with a brittle courage. Jonah's jaw tightened, the muscles twitching under his beard. "Kane don't forgive debts," he said flatly. "Don't matter who pays." Eliza's fingers curled into fists at her sides, the map and locket burning like coals in her mind. The fire popped, a log settling deeper into the embers, sending a spray of sparks into the air. Outside, the snow muffled everything, the tall, dark pines, sentinels against the storm. Lila's voice broke the hush, soft and trembling. "I saw him," she whispered, her eyes glassy, distant. Eliza turned, the air seeming to be still. "Who?" she asked gently. Lila's gaze drifted to the window, her breath fogging the glass. "A man in the snow, watching." His face was dark, like a shadow. Eliza felt a chill creep down her spine, a cold deeper than the winter wind. Jonah's head tilted slightly, his expression unreadable, though something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, or perhaps fear. Eliza's pulse quickened, her mind racing. Who was out there? The storm groaned against the cabin walls, its weight pressing in, making the space feel smaller and closer. Jonah straightened, brushing snow from his sleeves, his shoulders stiff. "Stay sharp," he warned, voice low and hard. "Kane's a wolf in a man's coat. You got little ones to think about." Eliza's breath caught in her throat. "What do you know about him?" she asked, her words sharp, demanding. Jonah's eyes met hers, dark and unflinching. "Plenty," he said after a pause, his voice heavy with things left unsaid. "But some truths you gotta find out for yourself." The fire crackled between them, and the creaking fabric was the only sound as Jonah adjusted his coat. He glanced at the children again, Mara's stubborn chin, Elias's tense jaw, Tessa's wide, waiting eyes, then turned toward the door. Without another word, he stepped back into the snow, the storm swallowing him whole. The door thudded shut behind him, the latch clicking into place like the final note in a song. Silence pressed down, broken only by the wind's cry and the soft breaths of the children. Eliza turned, her heart pounding, the weight of their stares on her shoulders. Tessa tugged her sleeve, her voice no louder than a whisper. "Miss Eliza, what do we do now?" Eliza swallowed, her throat tight, her hands trembling. She moved to the table, unfurling the map, tracing the lines Thomas had drawn, her finger halting over the coordinates, an abandoned mine buried deep in the hills. The thought chilled her more than the storm. The cabin seemed to close in, the fire flickering low, the shadows lengthening. She gathered the children close, wrapping them in a quilt, feeling their small bodies pressed against her. Outside, the snow fell thick and silent, blanketing the world in white. The pines stood tall, unmoving, as if they had seen all this before. Eliza sat in the dim glow, the map heavy in her lap, the locket cool against her palm. A stranger had come and gone, leaving questions that burned brighter than the fire. And in the quiet, she knew she couldn't run. Not yet. Nora's cough rattled through the cabin like dry twigs snapping beneath heavy boots. Her breath came in ragged, wheezing gasps, pale cheeks flushed with fever's burn. Caleb swaddled tight and whimpered weakly, his tiny body slick with sweat, limbs limp as wet cloth. The air inside grew thick and damp with illness, the faint scent of sickness mixing with the sharp tang of wood smoke. Eliza moved through the cramped space, sleeves rolled, hair damp with sweat, a damp cloth in one hand and a spoon in the other. She dipped the cloth into a bowl of cool water, wrung it tight, and dabbed it across Nora's brow, her other hand, checking Caleb's pulse, counting each flutter beneath her fingertips. Panic scratched at her throat, but she pushed it down, focusing on the task before her. "Mara, fetch the kettle," she instructed, her voice strained but firm. Mara obeyed without her usual scowl, moving quickly, urgency stripping her of defiance. Eliza tore a strip from her shawl, dampened it, and laid it across Caleb's forehead, whispering. The fire hissed as wet logs smoked, the heat barely holding back the cold seeping through the walls. Outside, the wind moaned, but Eliza had no time to listen. She stirred a pot of thin broth, made from bones she'd boiled down to the marrow, scraps of carrot floating in the greasy water. Margaret Hale knocked once, a quick rap before stepping inside, face creased with worry, hands full of small cloth bags. "Here," she said, voice tight. "Willow bark, ginger root, elderflower." Eliza's hands shook as she took them. "Thank you." Mara moved beside her face pale and her eyes hard. They worked side by side, grinding herbs, steeping tea and wiping sweat from their brows. Caleb's cries weakened into hoarse sobs, then silence, which scared Eliza more than the noise. She laid her palm on his chest, feeling the faint, shallow rise and fall, whispering, "Stay with me, little one, please." Jonah appeared in the doorway, snow clinging to his coat. His eyes caught hers, dark and steady. Thomas owed Kane. "Gold," he said quietly, as if it explained everything. Eliza's chest tightened, questions burning, but there was no time. She nodded a hard, small motion once and turned back to the children. The cabin smelled of sweat, herbs, and damp wood. She sang to them an old lullaby, the melody cracked and wavering, her voice hoarse but soft. "Hush now, the wind will pass, the dark will lift, and the dawn will last." Finn curled against her leg, eyes red, and Tessa buried her face in the quilt. Mara helped spoon broth into Nora's mouth, her hands steady, her lips pressed tight. Eliza's voice faltered as she wiped Caleb's cheeks, the small face so hot, so fragile. Her hands never stopped moving, tearing cloth, mixing herbs, checking pulses, whispering encouragement. She opened the trunk again, searching for another blanket, another scrap of warmth, and her fingers caught on something smooth tucked beneath a folded shirt. A letter, folded neat, creased at the edges. Eliza's breath caught as she unfolded it, eyes scanning the words, Thomas's handwriting sharp and hurried. "If I don't return, keep them from him." Her stomach dropped, the words burning into her mind. Him. Kane. The truth was tangled deep, but now there was no time for that. She folded the letter, tucking it into her apron, the knowledge settling like a stone in her chest. Caleb whimpered again, and she was back by his side, the letter already fading from her immediate thoughts, replaced by the sick boy's labored breaths. She dipped a cloth in the herbal tea Margaret had prepared, pressing it to his lips, her other hand stroking his hair, whispering the lullaby again. The hours stretched, endless, punctuated by the sounds of coughing, shallow breathing, the wind's howl, the crackle of the fire. Eliza's back ached, her hands raw, but she did not stop. Mara watched her, something softer in her gaze, as if the edges of her defiance had dulled. Finn clutched Eliza's skirt, refusing to let go even in sleep. The fever broke just before dawn, a sudden shift like the release of a breath held too long. Caleb's skin cooled beneath her hand, and his breathing deepened. Nora's cheeks, flushed and burning, began to pale, her cough loosening into soft, exhausted sighs. Eliza sagged onto the floor, tears slipping down her cheeks unchecked, the tension draining from her shoulders. Mara touched her sleeve in a hesitant, awkward motion. "You did it." Eliza looked up, meeting Mara's gaze, something unspoken passing between them. She pressed her lips to Caleb's forehead, a silent promise. The cabin was quiet, save for the crackle of the fire and the soft breathing of the children. Outside, the snow still fell, but inside, warmth held. Eliza's voice was barely above a whisper, rough and tired but filled with quiet strength. "I'll stay. I'll keep them safe." "Would you fight a fever in a frozen wilderness for strangers?" Follow Eliza's stand. The snow had barely settled when heavy boots crunched outside the cabin, a slow, deliberate pace that sent a cold shiver down Eliza's spine. The door rattled, a sharp knock punctuating the brittle air. Eliza stood, every muscle tight. Mara and Elias moved instinctively to her side, their eyes sharp, their breaths shallow. The latch lifted, the door swung open, and Silas Kane stepped through, filling the space like smoke in a small room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a dark coat lined with fur, the cuffs worn, the buttons gleaming. His face was lined, with years of brutal winters and harder choices, his eyes cold, calculating. The smile that crept across his lips was thin, sharp as a trap set in the snow. "Well," Kane drawled, voice smooth but edged with steel. "Seems I found myself a house full of orphans and a trespasser." His gaze swept the room, pausing on each child. Lila's wide, fearful eyes, Tessa's quivering hands, Finn's trembling lower lip. It lingered longest on Eliza, dark eyes narrowing. "I believe you're squatting on land that belongs to me." Eliza's jaw clenched, her heart hammering in her chest, but her voice came steady. This land was Thomas's. Kane's smile didn't falter. Thomas owed debts, big ones. Debts have a way of swallowing up everything left behind, land, livestock, family. He turned slightly, glancing toward the cradle where Caleb stirred, his breath soft and even. "Even little ones." Mara's voice cut through the room, clear and fierce. "You can't take them." Kane's eyes snapped to her, amusement flickering. "And who's going to stop me?" "You?" Elias stepped forward, shoulders squared. "We won't let you." Kane's expression darkened, the smile fading into a thin, flat line. The room seemed to hold its breath. Eliza felt the heat of the fire on her back, the weight of the children's eyes on her. Her fingers itched to grab the poker resting near the hearth. Jonah's voice came from the doorway, quiet but firm. "You best think twice, Kane. Thomas might not be as far as you think." The words hung in the air, sharp as an axe blade. Kane turned, his gaze narrowing at Jonah, who leaned against the frame, arms crossed, eyes steady. Eliza caught the flicker of uncertainty in Kane's eyes, a hesitation, a ripple of doubt. "Thomas is dead," Kane said, voice low. But something in how his eyes shifted betrayed the certainty. Jonah gave a slow shrug, his lips curling slightly. "Dead men don't always stay that way." The wind rattled the windows, a low, steady moan, like the breath of the wilderness itself. Kane's gaze snapped back to Eliza, his face a mask of hard angles. "This isn't over. I'll be back with the papers, and you'll wish you'd never set foot here." The threat dripped like oil, leaving a slick tension in its wake. Eliza lifted her chin, steady, unflinching. "You can try, Mr. Kane. We're not afraid." Finn tugged at Eliza's skirt, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ma?" The word slipped into the air, soft but solid, and it settled in Eliza's chest like a weight, heavy and warm. Her breath caught, eyes burning. She glanced at Finn, saw his small hand gripping her dress, and felt a surge of fierce resolve rise in her like the fire crackling behind her. Kane's eyes narrowed further, lips thinning to a hard line. Without another word, He turned, boots thudding heavily as he stepped into the snow, the door banging shut behind him. Silence rushed in, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the wind's distant howl. Eliza stood still, the echo of Kane's presence lingering like the chill in the air. She let out a breath, slow and controlled. Mara's eyes were bright and fierce. Elias's jaw was tight, his shoulders squared like a soldier. Even Tessa stood straighter, her hands no longer trembling. They were changing, hardening, shaping into something more substantial. Jonah's voice broke the quiet. He won't stop. You know that. Eliza nodded, her hands tightening into fists. Let him come. We'll be ready. The fire snapped, sending sparks into the dark. Outside, the stars glinted sharp and cold in the black sky, their light distant but unyielding. Inside, the warmth of the small fire held against the world's weight. The family huddled close, the fight just beginning. The dawn brought no warmth, just a pale light that filtered through the frost-crusted windows. Eliza laced her boots tight, the leather stiff and cold, and adjusted her coat. Jonah waited at the yard's edge, shovel in one hand, rifle slung over his shoulder, his breath curling in steady puffs. Together they set off, boots crunching over frozen ground, the trail to the mine half hidden under snowdrifts. Pines towered above, their branches heavy with ice, creaking as if they might snap beneath the weight. Eliza's heart thudded in her chest, and each step reminded her of the unknown waiting ahead. The wind bit at her cheeks, but she kept her gaze, fixed forward, following the map's lines etched deep in her mind. The air grew thinner as they climbed, the sky sharp as flint overhead. Half buried by a recent slide, the mine's entrance loomed at the base of a ridge, its wooden beams sagging under the weight of years. Ice clung to the rocks like frozen tears, and the dark mouth of the shaft gaped, waiting. Eliza's stomach twisted. She gripped the lantern, its light trembling, casting long shadows across the frozen earth. Jonah moved ahead, clearing a path. With a shovel, his movements deliberate. They slipped inside, boots echoing in the hollow silence. The air smelled of damp earth, old rot, and forgotten work. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. Her hands brushed against the rough walls as she stepped deeper, the lantern's glow catching on jagged surfaces. She found it behind a pile of splintered crates near the back. Thomas's leather-bound journal, edges worn smooth. Dust coated the cover, but her name was written inside in a familiar, hurried scrawl. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, flipping through pages filled with cramped handwriting. Words leaped out. Kane. Gold. The children. Too much. Eliza's chest tightened, each sentence cutting deeper. Thomas had stolen from Kane, taken what wasn't his to feed mouths left, empty. He had run and fled into the night, leaving them all behind. Betrayal burned sharp in her chest, hot as the tears she refused to let fall. He had called her here with promises, drawn her into this frozen, dangerous place, only to vanish when the weight grew too heavy. She shut the journal slowly, pressing it to her chest, the leather cold against her skin. Jonah's voice was quiet and steady, as if afraid to disturb the air. He might still be out there. Ain't nobody been found. Eliza shook her head, a hollow ache growing in her chest. He left us. Her voice cracked, low and bitter. Jonah's eyes didn't flinch. Maybe, maybe not. But you're here. The words settled, heavy with truth. She glanced at him, then at the shaft's shadows, as if Thomas might step from the dark and explain himself. But there was nothing. Only the cold, the stone, the echoes of a man who had run. They left the mine in silence. The journal tucked in her coat. The snow crunched underfoot, the sky a slate gray. clouds bruising the horizon. When they reached the cabin, the children clustered close, eyes wide with questions they didn't know how to ask. Eliza sat by the fire, unwrapping the journal and laying it on the table like an offering. Elias leaned in, tracing a finger over the name scrawled across the cover. Mara's gaze sharpened, waiting, watchful. Finn clung to her side, his small hands tight in her skirt. Eliza's voice was quiet, rough as gravel. He took from Kane. He thought he was helping you. But he ran when the trouble came. Silence stretched, taut as a wire. Amos sat on the floor, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. Eliza noticed his gaze, the way he stared at the letters, lips moving soundlessly. Her heart twisted. She reached for the journal, turning a page, tapping the words. "Can you read this?" Amos shook his head, his cheeks reddening. Eliza's voice softened. "Come here, let's try." They sat close, her finger underlining the words as she sounded them out, patient and steady. Amos stumbled over the letters, but his brow furrowed in concentration, determination glinting in his eyes. Lila leaned in, watching with quiet wonder. Mara's gaze flickered, something softer at the edges, the hard lines of anger loosening. Eliza's throat tightened, a strange warmth blooming in her chest. The betrayal was still there, a bitter ache under her ribs, but it no longer defined her. She looked around, at the children gathered close, at the worn walls of the cabin, the fire's glow casting them in soft light. They were hers, these children, not by blood but by choice. They had woven together by the threads in the face of storms, hunger, and fear. She would not run, she would stay. Eliza's voice was firm, a quiet promise as the wind howled outside. "We'll make it through, together." The journal lay open, pages fluttering in the draft, a record of a man's mistakes. Eliza's hands were steady. As she turned the page, her heart lighter with the weight she chose to carry. What if the man you trusted left you to fix his mistakes? See how Eliza builds a future. The wind carried the sharp crack of boots on ice, slow and heavy until the cabin door shuddered beneath a clenched fist. Eliza rose, heart a drumbeat against her ribs. Elias moved beside her, tall and silent, while Mara's eyes burned with a defiance that seemed to light the room brighter than the fire. The door swung open, and there he stood, Silas Kane, his coat buttoned tight, a stack of papers clutched in one gloved hand. His smile was thin, sharp as a trap, his gaze sweeping over them, like a knife across the cloth. "I've come for what's mine," he said, voice smooth as oil but cold as the Alaskan night. Eliza didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her voice steady, low but unshaking. "You'll find nothing here that belongs to you." Kane's smile widened, though his eyes stayed flat, dead. He raised the papers, the ink sharp against the yellowed parchment. "Debts don't vanish, ma'am. These children, this land, they're collateral. Thomas knew it. Now you do too," Finn whimpered, clutching Eliza's skirt, his small voice breaking the tense hush. "Ma?" The word settled heavily in the room, and Kane's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something dark passing across his face. Eliza's breath caught, a weight settling in her chest. She laid a hand on Finn's head, firm and sure, grounding him, grounding herself. Mara's shoulders squared, her voice slicing the air. "You're not taking us." Elias stepped forward, tall, steady, the lines of boyhood stripped from his face by the harshness of what lay before them. "You'll have to go through us first." The fire crackled, embers popping as if echoing the room's pulse. Kane's jaw tightened, but he kept his smile, which looked brittle now, a mask ready to crack. "This ain't over," he hissed. Jonah's voice cut in from the doorway, calm but firm. "Might want to think twice, Kane. Thomas ain't as far gone as you think." Kane's head snapped toward Jonah, a flash of uncertainty breaking through the mask. Eliza caught it, the momentary fracture, the doubt, and held it tight in her mind. The air hummed with tension, the walls of the cabin pressing close. Outside, neighbors gathered, Margaret with her arms crossed tight, Jonas Whitby gripping a spade, Mrs. Ellis standing stiff in her shawl. They had come quietly but purposefully, drawn by the storm in the air. Kane's gaze flicked across them, assessing, calculating. He took a half step back, the cold wind swirling around him like a warning. Eliza raised her chin, her voice a low thread of steel. "You'll leave now, Mr. Kane, and you'll leave us in peace." The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Kane's eyes, hard and glinting, met hers, but the weight of the room, the eyes on him, the fire's glow, the strength rising behind Eliza, shifted the ground beneath his boots. He gave a stiff nod, the papers crumpling in his fist, and turned, boots crunching in the snow, coat snapping in the wind. The door thudded shut, the latch clicking firm. Silence swelled, then released like a breath long held. The children clustered close, Eliza's arms around them, the bright fire, shadows dancing on the walls. The cabin felt different, as if the walls had shifted, the air lighter, and the ground steadier beneath their feet. Outside, the stars shone sharp and cold, distant points of light in the dark. Eliza stepped onto the porch, her breath curling in the crisp air, and saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, barely a silhouette. She narrowed her eyes, heart quickening, but the figure turned, swallowed by the shadows. "Thomas?" A question she couldn't voice, not yet. She turned back, her gaze falling on the small patch of earth near the cabin where the snow had begun to melt. Tomorrow she would plant. She would sow seeds where fear had once taken root. The garden would grow, and so would they, together. Spring breathed life back into the land, the snow melting into clear streams that raced over stones, carrying winter's grip away. The sky stretched wide and blue, dotted with clouds drifting lazily. The homestead stirred with quiet purpose. Chickens, scratching in the dirt near a new coop, their feathers ruffling in the gentle breeze. Eliza stood with her hands in the soil, fingers stained dark from planting seeds. The earth felt soft, full of promise, the air scented with damp pine and the sharp bite of melting frost. She looked up to see Mara laughing, chasing Finn across the yard as he ran, his legs pumping, cheeks pink, his giggles ringing. Elias helped Jonah mend a fence, their shoulders squared, working in quiet rhythm, while Tessa and Lila gathered eggs, their baskets swinging. The sound of Caleb's babbling drifted from the porch, where Margaret watched, knitting a scarf as the sun warmed the boards beneath her feet. Eliza wiped the sweat from her brow, heart light in a way she hadn't felt in months. The children had changed. Mara's eyes held a spark of humor. Elias stood taller, his gaze steady and sure. Finn darted across the field without fear, and Lila hummed softly as she worked. They were growing stronger, stitched together by the days they had weathered the storms that had tested them and the hope that had kept them standing. Inside the cabin, Eliza sat at the table in the evening, candlelight flickering as she wrote. Her pen scratched across the paper, the words steady, sure. She promised to raise these children independently, open her door to those in need, and build something lasting. Her heart ached, but it beat stronger now, steady with resolve. A soft knock sounded as she folded the letter, sealing it with a careful crease. The children turned, eyes wide, as Eliza rose. A man stood at the threshold, face shadowed by the setting sun, his features obscured, but the voice that spoke was rough, familiar. "You've done well here," he said, the words lingering like smoke. Eliza's breath caught, and her pulse quickened, but the man stepped back, swallowed by dusk, leaving questions in his wake. She turned, her gaze sweeping the room. Jonah leaning against the wall, arms crossed, watching silently. Mara wiping her hands on her apron. Elias standing near the hearth, jaw firm. Tessa rocked Caleb while Finn tugged at Eliza's skirt, his voice soft. "Ma, can we plant more tomorrow?" The words settled warm in her chest, a weight she welcomed. She smiled a slight but specific curve of her lips and nodded. "Yes, we'll plant more." The cabin glowed, the fire crackling steady, casting light over the faces that looked to her now, not as a stranger, but as their own. Outside, stars pricked the sky, sharp and bright, the promise of another day shining clear. The air hummed with quiet hope, the seeds buried in the earth waiting to bloom. Eliza built a home from nothing. Can you share her story to inspire others? Join her next chapter. Like, comment, and subscribe to follow this journey.